Is God primarily a concept, or is God a person? I read a book some years ago by the renowned biologist and self-professed atheist Richard Dawkins called The God Delusion. In one of the more poignant chapters of that text, Dawkins attempted to argue against the commonly held Christian belief that the concept of God simplifies our understanding of reality. To demonstrate that point, Dawkins set out to calculate the likelihood of the existence of a godlike being in the universe. I'm paraphrasing Dawkins's argument a bit, but essentially he concluded that, statistically speaking, a godlike being is possibly the least likely hypothesis ever to have been sincerely posited by humanity. And the mathematics of his argument were compelling. After all, what are the odds that a being exists somewhere in reality who has always been and always will be, who is truly unique, and who has the capacity to create and sustain a universe such as the one in which we live? I think I agree with Dawkins that simply to sit down and hypothesize the existence of such a being would take more than an act of imagination. Any such hypothesis would be an act of lunacy. I agree with Dawkins. To believe in God as a concept is nonsensical. But have Christians come to believe in God by way of God as a concept? Have Christians come to worship God because we were first convinced that the existence of God is more likely than not? I don't think so. I think the reason we believe in God is because God has personally encountered humanity. Now, religious people throughout history have been fairly consistent in speaking of their faith objects as real. I'm sure there have always been skeptics to one degree or another, but by and large it would seem that religious people who believe in some sort of a deity or deities have presumed those beings to be in some way real entities. However, one of the things that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus has revealed is that as real as humans might like to argue our gods are, we really prefer conceptual gods to gods who are real, distinct persons. We may believe in God because of the preserved history of God's personal encounters with humanity and humanity's encounters with a personal God, but we prefer to keep that in the past. We prefer the present God we worship to be conceptual. My hope is that this series will help to support that assertion to some degree. But the real thrust of our discussions will focus more on the question of why it is that the temptation to conceptualize God has proven so very difficult to resist, even for Christians. It seems to me that most contemporary discussions about God really are conceptual discussions. The question, do I believe in God, often becomes a question of whether the idea or concept of God makes sense to me or seems tenable to me, as it did for Dawkins in the quotation I shared earlier. The question, can the existence of God be proven, also often becomes a discussion of the evidence for or likelihood of a God. Christian apologists, too, have long been trying to prove that the existence of God is possible, even probable, but that again is a conceptual conversation. The difficulty in speaking of God as a person is that a person, at least as we understand the term in relation to human beings, may not be completely logical or entirely predictable, or even in many ways thoroughly quantifiable. By the mathematical odds, there shouldn't be any life on Earth, according to secular science. And yet, here we are. Some would call that winning the cosmic lottery. Whatever the odds, it's the reality. Someone might say the same thing about God. Whatever the odds, it is the reality. How do we know? Well, because of a personal encounter. And yet, after having that personal encounter, and the reality of God being thrust before us, quickly we put it into a conceptual category. And again, why? Well, dealing with a person is difficult. A person is whatever that person demonstrates her or himself to be. And any definition then has to be curtailed by the reality of the individual, who often can be difficult to pin down. Now, the question of whether we believe in a God is an important one, no doubt. The question of what we believe about God is equally important. The question of what we think about the Christian understanding of God, or the Muslim understanding of God, or the Hindu understanding of God, those are all important inquiries. I'm suggesting today that these ways of considering the question of God, as valuable as they may be, fundamentally deal with God as a concept and not as a person. And therefore they are less foundational. It is the personal encounter with God, not the mathematical likelihood of God's existence, that founds the Christian religion, the Jewish religion before it. The personal encounter with Abraham, the personal encounter with Moses and the people of Israel, the personal encounter of the apostles of Jesus with God in the flesh, with Jesus. These are the foundation, not the concept. The concept is derivative of the personal encounter. I hope these introductory comments prepare us to explore our primary biblical passage today in the New Testament Gospel according to John. Today we'll be discussing John chapter 18, verses 28 through 40. And these verses constitute John's recounting of Jesus' trial before Pilate on the morning of his crucifixion. John's account is the longest of the four gospel descriptions of this encounter, and I think at the heart of John's interpretation of this episode is the distinction that I've been trying to draw between God as a concept and God as a person. In this account of Jesus' trial before the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, I believe we'll encounter three conflicts which push God and Jesus out of the realm of conceptual and into the realm of the personal. We'll explore one of these conflicts in each discussion of this series, and the first conflict is the conflict between the predictable and the unpredictable. God as a concept is a predictable reality, whereas God as a person has proven to be unpredictable. If you have Bibles with you, I invite you to turn with me to John chapter 18. I'm going to begin reading in verse 28. This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. To this point in the story, Jesus had already been condemned as a blasphemer by the Jewish authorities. But Jewish leaders were not autonomous at this point in history. They were subjects of the Roman Empire, and they were, therefore, not technically at liberty to exercise a death sentence legally. If they had been free to execute a person, they might have stoned Jesus according to the covenant of Sinai. And of course, there are examples of certain Jewish leaders taking the initiative to execute folks deemed guilty of capital crimes under the covenant of Sinai without specific Roman approval. The stoning of Stephen in the book of Acts is an example of this. But Jesus was a particularly public figure with a large following, and who had already been embraced by at least one Roman centurion, along with a handful of other significant Jewish leaders. His trial and execution had to be handled by the book, so to speak, so they brought Jesus to the Romans. This put crucifixion on the table, and that's what John appears to have been getting at in his parenthetical comment in verse 32. I think it's important to notice the careful way in which John has described the Jewish leadership followed the guidelines of the covenant of Sinai as they had been interpreted by Jewish tradition while they were conspiring to have the God who authored that covenant put to death. It's a sad irony in John, but an interesting series of events to observe. It was against rabbinic law to sentence someone to death at night, and so the Jewish leaders waited until early morning to treat with Pilate. The rabbinic interpretation of the covenant of Sinai also associated uncleanness with Gentile homes. Why that was is debated, but it seems likely that Gentiles were known to bury aborted or stillborn children on their premises. Therefore, it may have been out of fear of the uncleanness of coming into the presence of a dead body that was at stake, Whatever the reason, though, the Jewish leaders remained outside out of a sense of submission to God's covenant. Both of these pious behaviors might have hurt the Pharisees. First, condemning Jesus at night would have been far less public, but it wasn't an option. Second, refusing to enter Pilate's abode allowed Jesus and Pilate to speak privately, which certainly would have been disconcerting for the Jewish leaders. Nonetheless, they were willing to walk a more difficult road out of a sense of faithfulness to God through the covenant. This, I believe, illustrates to some degree the problem Jesus himself posed for his Jewish contemporaries. Jewish tradition had come to associate God with the First Testament to such a degree that they couldn't recognize God when he came in the flesh. God had been so conceptualized and dogmatized for the Jewish tradition that they had come to presume that God had revealed himself so completely to them that any behavior that fell outside of their expectations was automatically associated with an origin other than God. They could not imagine that God would take on human flesh. And so they would not even entertain the possibility. There is a benefit to believing in God conceptually like this. A concept can be subordinated to other more tangible concerns quite easily. In the case of the Jewish culture of Jesus' day, the concept of God had been subordinated to the covenant of Sinai and to the rabbinic tradition. Concepts are often vague and indeterminate, and therefore require mediation, interpretation, and so on. Once the Jewish tradition had subordinated the concept of God to their own traditional readings of Torah, then God became predictable, and therefore somewhat controllable. Jesus was unrecognizable in large part because he did not fit within Jewish expectation. But as we see with Jesus, a person is far less predictable and malleable than a concept. The Jewish leadership was no longer interested in knowing or encountering God. As far as they were concerned, that search had already been engaged in and had been answered. It had been fulfilled. They met him at Sinai. They were now more interested in solidifying their present understanding of God. A person rarely fits into the mold we make for them. Our spouses probably shattered the conceptions of a marriage partner we carried with us into our nuptials. Similarly, God as a person will, in times and seasons, shatter our conception of him as well. And this is not actually a new realization in biblical history. For example, the prophet Habakkuk came face to face with God when God told him he was going to raise up a horribly evil, violent, and corrupt people to come and slaughter the nation of Israel. And Habakkuk was blown away. How could God bless evil people by allowing them to conquer his own people? I mean, Israel certainly was disobedient, though in Habakkuk's day things had gotten better. But destroy his own people by lifting up and giving wealth, power, and political dominion to a thoroughly godless and idolatrous people? Habakkuk did not expect that, and his prior understanding of God would not fit into his present experience. However, by the end of the book, Habakkuk was willing to alter his understanding of God to fit these unexpected events. The Jewish leaders who condemned Jesus would not follow in his footsteps. They would not alter their views by allowing God in the flesh to correct the presumptions that they had made of God as a concept. To say it another way, they allowed their conceptual presumptions about God to condemn the person of God in the flesh as a liar and as an impostor. And we shouldn't be too hard on our Jewish forebears. When God acts other than we expect him to act, we may find ourselves responding similarly. Because God is personal and not merely conceptual, we must release the security that comes from certainty and predictability and embrace the risk that comes with following a personal God. God may not always do what we believe he should. God may not always act in ways of which we from our human perspective approve. But none of that is pertinent to whether God exists. Nor does unexpected behavior on the part of God prove that he is untrustworthy. When God surprises us, All that means is that our assumptions about God were wrong. Faith then adjusts and continues to follow. Only the faithless condemn God for failing to embody the conceptual paradigm we have built.